about the topic of data science in journalism. But before that, I want to share with you that we, as Data Science Society, are making the domain of data science popular, and this is our goal. And currently, we are having this campaign, volunteer campaign, for all of you who might be interested to help in some of our projects. And I want to welcome you on 29th of August, next week on Thursday, here in Limplum. We are really glad we are partnering with Limplum, and thank you for hosting us today here. Welcome to all of you next week on Thursday, when we will discuss several projects we are going to launch soon, because currently we are doing these data science meetups, datathons, which are data science hackathons, also different trainings and lots of other stuff. Project that we will launch soon is special interest groups, but to learn more about it, come next week. And today we have really two interesting topics. And if you have any questions during the presentations, I advise you to join us in Slido. Ask your questions using DSS code. And yeah, thank you again. I want to thank also our other partners from Telelink and Ontotext, and actually present you our first speaker, Andrey Tagarev from Ontotext.
Okay, can everyone hear me, or is this thing not really working? Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Andrey and I work at Ontotext, and I'll be talking to you about this project WeVerify. So basically it's a European project that's 9 months into its 3-year run. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about are tools that we're just figuring out how to integrate, or tools we're planning to do, and there are several partners. So within the WeVerify project, there's both multiple technical partners and also multiple partners from journalistic organizations. So the first 9 months, we've spent a lot of time figuring out what the best way to put all our technology together is. The project itself is not oriented towards research so much as getting people who have technology and getting experts who need technology to do different kinds of debunking and fighting against fake news, and figuring out how to put all of this together in a meaningful way that's useful for people. So as I said, the project itself and the presentation, it's going to be a lot more about a high-level overview of the different things we intend to do than specific results, because we're in the early stages of the project yet. But I guess the first question we want to talk about are, what are fake news and does it really matter? So I'm hoping all of you have this intuition that there is a problem related to disinformation online, and it's spreading a lot, and it's leading to some kind of negative effect. But if we decide to go beyond intuition, there is this survey. It was based in different countries in the EU. It has over 25,000 responders. So the first question, well, this is the second question from the survey, but the first one we really care about is, how often do people think they run into different kinds of false information or misleading information online? So we found 37% of people claim they do that on a daily basis, and another 31% say they do it they run into that at least once a week. So it's obviously a widespread phenomenon, and we're not the only ones that think this is happening all over the place. People have a feeling like they're constantly running into unreliable information online. So then the second question is, how confident are people that they can identify this false information and figure out what's false or wrong about it? So in this case, 15% said they are very confident they can identify it and figure out what's wrong with it. And 56% said they're somewhat confident. Putting aside the question of, are these people actually right? Because it's well known that we tend to trust people we respect or people who share our opinions, and we question their claims a lot less than people we don't like or disagree with us. But putting aside all of that, we can still see that the vast majority of people are not always confident that they can spot this fake information, and they're of course even less confident they can figure out exactly what's wrong with it. So there's some opportunity there for helping them out, figuring out how technology and experts can work with them to make this a more convenient and reliable process. So the last interesting question for us from that survey was asking people, well, if you're not confident you can always figure out what's wrong with it and what the truth is, who would you trust to tell you what the truth is and what's actually misinformation and what's true? As we can see, and luckily the top response is journalists, so 45% of people would trust journalists, and that's good because journalists are doing this right now. That's kind of their jobs for at least some of them. So people still trust them, and that's useful. But they're also okay with the government doing that for them, some kind of press and broadcasting management, or the social media platforms themselves doing some kind of self-policing, checking their own content before they put it out. They would also trust some reliable citizens, where this is kind of vaguely defined, but there needs to be some kind of way for regular citizens to be incorporated into the process. And then farther down, there's like EU institutions and NGOs. I guess these are a little bit too far away for people to trust them quite as much. But the useful conclusion here is that everyone has at least one, and usually a couple different kinds of experts that they would actually trust to go look at their data and provide well-reasoned explanations for what's misleading or what's wrong or what's misinformation. So there's definitely opportunity. If you can make this connection between the experts and the regular people browsing stuff online, then there is interest in doing that. I personally find it a little strange that so many people would trust national authorities to do this kind of stuff, because we've gotten a lot of examples of how these kinds of misinformation campaigns would actually allow people to get in power. But people trust experts. So if we're going to be talking about experts, let's do just a couple formal definitions of stuff. Generally, the term that was popular for the last several years was fake news, and the journalists now are kind of trying to move away from it because it's become both a very loaded term and it's kind of vague. So if something is fake news, first you might just have an immediate response of, they're just trying to attack someone I trust. But beyond that, it's not very descriptive. In what way is it fake? Is it totally false? Is the person just incorrect in what they're stating but truly believes it? That kind of stuff is lost. So if we do three different definitions, we can say there's misinformation, which is incorrect information being shared by people who honestly believe in it. There's disinformation, which is incorrect information shared by someone who knows it's wrong, but they're trying to achieve some kind of malicious goal by sharing that information. And there's malinformation, which is the most hard to grasp kind, which is someone is sharing either an opinion or an accurate fact, but they're doing it in such a way that they want to have some malicious effect. Now, these would often be different kinds of logical fallacies in arguments, whataboutism, these kinds of things, where you change the topic and you don't necessarily lie in what you're saying, but you kind of deflect the discussion into some other direction. So we can easily visualize this as partially overlapping. On the left, we have the misinformation, which is just the wrong information by someone who probably got tricked into sharing it and honestly believes it. But this person most likely didn't originate this. They saw it somewhere else, they believed it, and they continued sharing it. On the right, we have the malinformation, which is the deliberate changing of direction of discussion and that kind of stuff, where you can't really say it's fake. You can't go and say, well, this is logically incorrect. The best you can say is, this is not the topic of discussion, perhaps. But the bit we're really interested in falls in the center, the disinformation. So this is incorrect, and also it's intentionally shared by someone who knows it's incorrect. So you can't just say to the person, well, you're actually not right. This is not a picture of what you're saying, or the statement you're making isn't technically accurate, because that person either knows and doesn't care, or doesn't know but doesn't care anyway. They're just trying to achieve some other goal, and they're sharing made-up information for it. So we're going to be focusing a lot on the disinformation, which is, again, the intentional part is really important here. In that line of thinking, there are several common forms of wrong information online. So I wouldn't claim these 7 are an exhaustive list of the different kinds of problems, but there are going to be ones that we see a lot of examples of. So the first one is satire or parody. So maybe you know Poe's law, but basically there's no statement you can make online so absurd that someone wouldn't believe you really mean it. Well, this is exactly it. You're making some utterly absurd claim thinking people are going to laugh, and then someone actually believes your claim, they share it, they respond to it as if you're making a valid point, that kind of stuff. So there's no intention to cause harm. This isn't really disinformation as such. This is just a mistaken communication. We're not really targeting these examples. Then there's the misleading content. So if we go back, the misleading content is our malinformation case. It's not technically incorrect. It's just presented in a way that misleads people into either changing the topic or discussing the wrong thing or believing the wrong thing despite not really being told a lie. But then all the other kinds we're going to be discussed here, these are general, genuine disinformation. So these are going to be things that we can run into in practice. So firstly, imposter content. You've probably seen some of these. They're not super common, but they're sources online that pretend to be some legitimate organization, but they really aren't. They just have a name that sounds kind of similar. So CCN News Broadcast or something. So it might sound like, oh, this is CNN, they're respectable, but they're actually pretending to be someone they're not. Then there's the case of fabricated content, which is entirely made up. There haven't been too many cases of this until now, but with the rise of deepfakes and stuff like that, it's expected that they're soon going to be more common and important, because now you can make an entirely fake picture or fake video of someone saying something that they didn't actually say. And we're kind of preemptively thinking in the direction of how do you counter that, even though there's still no big examples of it happening in the news cycle yet. There's the false connection. I'm sure everyone is kind of very familiar with that. You see a really bombastic headline, or under the headline there's some very shocking picture, and you open the news article and it turns out, well, no, it's the quote was a little bit out of context. It's not really that absurd of a claim, or the picture isn't actually related to what happened. This is like a reenactment or something. And the very similar example is the false context. And this is one of the most common ones, along with manipulated context. So false context is, for example, you say there are a bunch of refugees in Calais, France, in the graveyard knocking down statues because they're against Christianity. And you show a picture of people knocking down statues, and the actual reality is, yeah, it is a picture of people knocking down statues in a graveyard, but it didn't happen in France at all. It happened years ago. So the picture kind of shows what you're claiming, but you're really pulling it out of context and pretending like something else is happening. And then the manipulated content is one step further. You take a picture, you add something. You'll see an example of this in a little bit, where you take a picture that's already a clash between protesters and police, and then you slap a flag on it, and it's suddenly like the police are trying to bring down the Catalan flag, and it becomes a lot more charged and political by manipulating the contents of the image. So these are kind of the different kinds you often run into. As I said, it's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but most examples would fall into one of these. So how does this misleading information appear and spread online, and where do we want to intercept it? How do we want to prevent its spread or combat its spread? Well, for one, there are these 6 questions of what, who, when, where, why, and how. And if we can answer all of them, we can kind of figure out exactly what's happening. But they're kind of ordered in terms of how difficult they are to answer. So the first one is the most straightforward. What is being spread? Well, that's what's the actual claim that we're going to evaluate. Is it false or true? Is it an image? Is it a news article? Is it a single tweet that's causing the reaction? So this is like the first step. You have to identify what the piece of content you're interested in is before you can keep going. Then the who, when, and where is kind of available in metadata. So we can reasonably expect to be able to get this kind of information because they're typically usernames, which might not be quite as solid as like a specific identity of a journalist, but there's still someone we can identify. And there's similarly information for when stuff is posted online, which social network or website it is, or where it's claiming something happened. So these kinds of questions take a little bit of work, but we can still answer them for most pieces of content. And then the really high bars are the why it spreads and how it spreads. So we have some tools towards the how it's spreading, the spread of information in social media, but these get kind of very high level analysis. So they wouldn't really be something you do for every single piece of misleading content. And even if it's something is important enough that you try to answer why it's spreading and how it's spreading, that would definitely take some serious analysis by an expert. It's not something the algorithm is going to figure out by itself. We're not trying to make some general AI that's going to say, well, people are actually sharing this because they believe that and this is happening. Yeah.
I have an idea. What about religion? Is religion and misinformation, is your algorithm going to classify it by
So
information or disinformation? Because we know the planet was not created 6,000 years ago.
see that becomes, it's going to become a little bit more obvious later on, but what we've figured out is while we can try to make some algorithms do this automatically, we're kind of sticking away from trying to make it fully automatic. The point is to make tools that make identifying it easy and make analyzing it easy, but we leave the judgment themselves to journalists. Because one thing we can see from this this question here is no one says I'm trusting an algorithm to tell me what's true or not. Yeah, so people don't really expect, and even if we see scientists, it wouldn't really be the algorithm itself that people are trusting. So we keep the experts in the loop. We try to give them the tools to very quickly and easily analyze, but then they say, I'm a journalist, I'm this person, you can check my history, and based on these analysis, I'm saying this is true or false, or this is incorrect in this way. So then the aim is to put a little bit more information in there and justify the reaction as opposed to just giving it a binary, this is fake or it's not fake. So in that sense, if the journalists are interested in addressing a tweet claiming the Earth is 6,000 years old, they can do it and they can justify why it's not. Presumably they'll link to Wikipedia. I don't know how much research they're going to put into it. But there's not going to be an algorithm telling you, oh no, I have a knowledge base and it tells me the Earth is a lot more than 6,000 years old. So the actual life cycle of this information, we can kind of think of the whole process in 4 abstract stages. So the first one is the actual creation of the disinformation. So as you can see, there's both, or maybe you can't, I don't know if it's too small, but there's both some play on social division or other kind of emotional topic. So this is the malicious intentional part of the disinformation. And there's also some kind of use of digital content, whether it be memes, images, an essay, a video, some other misleading content. So you combine your intention to cause some kind of upheaval with some specific piece of evidence or text or any kind of digital media that's making a claim. And both are important because you can't really go and say, well, your claim about this political party or this religion is right or wrong, but you can counter the digital content that's reinforcing some kind of belief. So if we go back to the Calais example, if someone just tweets Muslims are violent, you can't really, it's a very big topic. You can't give one simple counter to that. But if they say Muslims are violent because here they are destroying statues, then you can go and counter and be like, well, no, that's not really what's happening. The video is out of context. It's not happening where you're saying. The person is not doing it for the reasons you're saying. So that's why we're kind of targeting this combination of malicious intent and some specific piece of content. So once you actually create your disinformation, which happens somewhere off in the mysterious depths of the internet, it starts spreading and propagating online. So there are different kinds of propagation. It can be automatic with bots or semi-automatic by trolls who are a bunch of other people who still know it's probably not true, but they're sharing it because they're malicious actors. You can rely on advertisements or other kinds of tools. But there is at some point in the life cycle, if it's successful, where you get some genuine propagation, people who actually start believing your disinformation and start sharing it. And that's kind of the point where we're really aiming to go and counter with facts. Because if you catch that early enough, then a bunch of people who intentionally share something they know is wrong aren't really going to convince anyone if you put your counter argument soon enough and you show people that it's wrong or it's malicious. But then once it starts propagating, there's the question of detection, as I said, which requires monitoring and some kind of automated detection. And as I said, we're not really aiming at algorithms that are automatically going to tell you something is misinformation or disinformation, but we are aiming at ways of monitoring that can make it easier for experts like journalists to actually find these things as they're taking off and evaluate them relatively early on. And then a lot of our effort is aimed at the verification. So these are different kinds of tools that help with the analysis that can produce some results that are convincing but still rely on a human looking at the analysis and justifying or explaining what it means and why it's important. And then the final step is the impact, which is also important, but it's a lot more vague. The dissemination. So once you found your expert and you've identified some piece of disinformation, and your expert has looked at it and they have figured out what's wrong with it, how it's disinforming people or misleading people, then you kind of need to go out there and get it to the regular people. Because one of the big problems is if you come in a day late, then there are already thousands of people who saw it the first time. They probably won't see the thing you're sharing. And most likely, unless you're very, very famous, even if you go and debunk it and show exactly how it's wrong, if the first thing has taken off and there are thousands of people sharing it, and then you're the one person sharing the debunk, then it's still going to keep growing for a while before people start becoming aware that it's false. So our tools are both aimed at monitoring and verification, but also there's a separate part of the project where we're looking for better ways to disseminate this information once it becomes available. Okay, so there's this general, it's not a hard rule, but there's this general workflow of kind of how this disinformation gets started and spread online. So 4chan is not quite the anonymous web, it's also not the only example, but it starts in these specific parts online where a lot of people are only taking this kind of stuff semi-seriously, and a lot of them are also producing fake content sometimes, so there are these communities. And while it's useful to monitor them so you can catch this stuff as early as possible, it's not really a place where you can counter it, because the people there are the ones producing the disinformation. They're not going to get convinced by logical arguments. But once it's created, it first starts spreading through closed and semi-closed networks, it can be WhatsApp or Discord servers or other stuff like that, the ones that are not publicly accessible. Then it starts getting to certain sub-communities of larger social networks like Reddit or maybe YouTube channels, and then it starts picking up steam. At that point, some people who didn't participate in creating it might actually get fooled into fully believing the disinformation. And if it's successful enough and enough people believe it there, then it finally makes its way to the main social media, the biggest platforms, and at that point it's picked up a lot of steam. So once Twitter and Facebook people start sharing it, you're almost guaranteed that nearly everyone who's sharing it sort of believes it. And by that point, you really, really want to kind of counter it, because the people aren't really going to keep track of what's happening. So what's happening right now is that after this happens, professional media pick it up and then they publish an article debunking it perhaps. It might come pretty quickly. It might be the next day or maybe just 2 days later. But by that point, a lot of the people who've shared it have forgotten about the topic and just have this vague idea of something nefarious happening. So kind of the goal here is to do this print and debunk from the professional media, to pull it in as early as possible, and if possible, try to almost intertwine it with the main social media or even maybe the bigger conspiracy communities. So this information can be countered as early as possible. Okay, so this is the high-level idea of what we're trying to do and why we think it's very useful. Now I'm going to talk about the planned architecture. It's very high level because, as I said, we're less than a quarter into the project. So a lot of this stuff has been planned, but we're just beginning to implement it. So the high level stuff, the high level idea is that there are two workflows. On the bottom, we have the agents, which are the experts, so journalists and other reliable people who have a special access to a special workbench that has all the tools that I'm going to discuss in the next section. And all of these tools are different ways to analyze data, to monitor, to do stuff like that. So they're relatively expensive operations to perform. So you want to kind of limit them. You can't necessarily do it for every single tweet and every single article that exists. You need a person to initiate it. But these experts kind of go and examine data. And once they have something useful to say, they go and write it to the database. They make, a claim review or a debunk, and they write to the database. And we're backing this up with the idea of having a blockchain that confirms what people wrote when. So the basic idea of the blockchain is because the main database will probably be a bit too large for people to make copies of themselves. But we want to make this as trustworthy as possible. Then the idea is if the database lives at, say, Ontotext, which is what's going to be happening during the duration of the project, maybe not everyone in the whole world trusts us to keep stuff exactly the way we are doing it right now. And even later on, when it gets bigger, you want to be able to confirm that the contents of the database haven't been messed with. And that's the role of the blockchain. It's not going to be holding the full content. It's going to be holding just enough information to confirm that any piece of claim review or debunk that you extract from the database has been unmodified and is exactly what the author intended to commit there. And then the other part of that workflow is the regular users. So these are the normal citizens living their lives online who, through an alternative platform or chatbots or multiple other kinds of interfaces, have read access to the database, so they can get these kinds of debunks, and they can confirm that they're exactly what the author wanted the debunk to say, but they can't write new stuff to the database. At most, there's this optional feature that we're not sure whether we should include or not, where they can suggest stuff to be reviewed, but we haven't decided whether that's functionality we want to support yet or not. So this is a bit more detailed architecture of what's actually happening. But basically, both the big workbench and all the other user interfaces have access to an open source API layer, integration layer, that allows access to all the tools and read access to the database at the very least, and write access if you have the authority to write to the database. So the general idea is that we're going to develop example UIs for the workbench, for the journalist workbench, and for the chatbots and other citizen workbenches. But because the integration layer is open source and fully described, if it takes off, people can do their own implementations with their own functionalities however they see fit. And this integration layer is then an abstraction from between these services and the different kinds of tools. That's kind of necessary because none of these tools are set in stone. Obviously, the idea is to develop new ones, expand them, improve the functionality, and so on. So we're keeping this abstract layer. And also partially because some of these tools are not going to be open source. Some are. It's still in the process of being figured out. But basically, there's the opportunity to also develop your own tools and make them accessible to the integration layer as well. And then we have the data store, which is going to be somewhat complicated because obviously we work with multimodal data. So for one, we have the blockchain confirming the contents. But beyond that, we're storing texts, image analysis, video similarity, possibly other kinds of values. It's still being determined, stuff like social network analysis outputs. And these things are going to be held in a pretty complicated database. Okay, and a little bit about the database of known fakes. By the way, we're not super happy with the database of known fakes name, so if someone has a better suggestion, let me know afterwards, because it's not intended to only contain fakes. It's intended to contain everything that a journalist or an expert found worth reviewing and commenting on. So not necessarily everything in there is wrong. Some of it might be confirmed or just enriched with extra detail. But the general idea is that we have the central database that's kind of pointing off to other things. As I said, there's going to be image and video related content in there as well as social network stuff. And everything is kind of backed up by the blockchain that confirms the contents of the database have not been modified. And obviously the blockchain is distributed and every expert has their own key. So they, at the time of submitting a review, they write to the blockchain exactly what the contents of that review is, and we can't modify it afterwards, which should be very helpful for trustworthiness, at least. No one can say, oh, that's not what I said. The blockchain confirms that's exactly what you said. Now, you can kind of see the model of the data being contained here, but as an overview, the model of these reviews that are written to the database are an expansion of the claim review thing that's it's already being used for debunks and fake news reviews. So the general idea is you have one or more pieces of social media content. That's the thing on the left. It doesn't have to be social media, actually. Any kind of digital content. So anything available online. It can be pictures, it can be tweets, it can be news articles or videos. But all of this stuff is available somewhere online. And then a journalist comes in and identifies that that piece of content is making a specific claim. So the claim is something a person describes in words. If it's an article, it can be a quote from the article. But if it's a picture, maybe the person explains the contents of the picture. Or if it's a tweet containing a picture, maybe it's about the claim. So it can be a picture that says this is a clash between protesters and police in Catalonia. Or if it's a tweet saying something, the claim might be that at this date the clash happened. So this kind of abstraction, we're not trying to do it automatically. We're letting the expert actually summarize what the claim is and identify multiple instances of that claim. So once we have the claim, the journalist can then make a review. So in this case, the example I've given, two separate people have decided to review the same claim. Now, this can be useful because maybe reviewer one wrote one kind of review, and then reviewer two was not happy. They didn't agree with what the first review said, so they want to make a counter argument. Or maybe they're perfectly happy with what reviewer one said, but they want to add some extra context. They have additional information that they think is helpful. For example, if we get back to that image, maybe reviewer one said this image is manipulated, the flag got added with Photoshop, so it's a fake image, it's a fake claim, and reviewer two comes in and says, yes, that's right, and also this is where the original image comes from, this is what the context is. So they can kind of like build on each other. And also the idea is that the different tools produce evidence. So the idea is that we want the reviewers to support their the reviews with as much evidence as possible. So in the case of the image, maybe it's one thing by the image assistant tool that did visual analysis, and it shows exactly what makes them think the image was doctored. And then another thing is a link to where the original image was posted, and you can see the original image was posted 3 years before the claimed event. So that obviously also shows the image was not only doctored, but taken entirely out of context. And maybe a third one is an article about the image written 2 years ago when it was sometimes used in a different case as disinformation, stuff like that. So it's a very flexible schema for our model. And this is kind of what it looks like in practice. Now, I'm sure you can't read any of that. But the general idea here is that in the lower left corner, you start with the actual digital content. So for example, a Twitter post or something, that's the content. And then as you move higher up, the thing in the upper left corner, that's the claim itself. So that's the person who described what the content means and what the claim being made is. And it's also the thing that's going to be reviewed. So here in the center, we have the claim review itself. That's where our expert comes in and explains what's wrong with this image, gives their reasoning. And once they give their reasoning, they also attach a bunch of different supporting evidence pieces. So this is one supporting evidence. It's a link to an article. So this is, for example, the one that's written out here. It's a tweet saying that immigrants are destroying statues at a graveyard in Calais. So the tweet says something like that with a link, with an image. So the claim then becomes a description of what the claim is, obviously. And then someone comes in reviewing and they say, no, this is not correct. It's taken completely out of context. So the first supporting evidence is a link to a news article about how it actually happened in Croatia, I believe, years ago. So you can get that piece of information. And the second piece of supporting evidence is actually, I forget what that one was. I think it was another news article about how 2 years ago the event actually happened. A year ago, someone used the same image in another disinformation campaign. So this is still useful information. It means that someone's repeatedly reusing this image in different contexts. And this is kind of how one chunk of information that would get written into a database by the person doing the review. Okay, so I've been talking a bunch about this evidence and the different tools that we're going to be developing. Some of these already exist and are going to be integrated, and some of them are still in the planning stages. So we kind of have an idea of what we want them to do, but they don't exist yet. So these are kind of the major tools that the workbench is going to be providing to the experts with their different kinds of analysis. Briefly going to go over each of them. The image verification assistant. This should work for both classical images and deepfakes. Currently, the one for classical images exists. And you can see this example here. I mentioned it a couple times, the clash between protesters and police in Catalonia during the elections a couple years ago. And you can see the image assistant, the verification assistant, I'm sorry, spits out a couple of different kinds of analyses. Some of these don't mean anything, like the third or these ones down here don't really show you anything. But in the first and the second and the fourth, you can kind of see pretty clearly, the red, the green edges, the purple lines. These are indications that the flag was added after the fact. So the image was doctored. And this is kind of like one piece of content. So if the journalist says the image was doctored, they attach this kind of analysis. And you don't need to trust them that it's doctored. You can actually get the backup of the algorithm showing exactly what happened. As I said, the deepfakes ones is still not developed. I know the partner that's doing that. It's a company called Swerth from Greece. I know they have some ideas about what it's going to do, but I also know it's a lot more complicated problem because you can't really apply the same kind of simple analysis that just pops up with an example of what's wrong with the image because all of it was generated. So it's a bit of a mystery to me how they're going to do the deepfakes image verification, but they say there are algorithms to do it, so I'm interested to see what they are. They also provide a video search service. Now, This is useful for both images and video, but for video especially, in terms of if you're questioning whether a video is legit or taken out of context and so on, you can kind of feed it to the service and it's going to do some quick analysis and give you similar videos. It can be partial overlap, so some scene in the videos is the same, but one is just a fraction of the other, or maybe they're only like partially similar and partially different. And this is useful because people re-upload both images and videos all the time, of course. What we want to be able to do is detect a re-upload of the same image or video, because we don't really want to repeat the analysis every time someone decides that, oh, they found my first upload, I'm going to give it a different URI and I'm going to pretend like it's new content. Okay, so there's this idea for the social graph analysis. It's going to look a lot like what the results for Gephi look like. This is entirely in the planning stages, so I'm showing you a Gephi graph of mine from a different project. But the general idea here is that once you collect a lot of data from social media, for example, Twitter, where there's very, very quick conversation and a simple topic can quickly spin into thousands or tens of thousands of tweets. At that point, you're not really reading through them, but we don't really care to read through all the retweets and like minor comments and stuff like that. We're kind of interested in identifying important participants in the discussion, ideally ones that actually got it started or got it diverted into a new topic. So this kind of social graph analysis, the idea is to be able to give this kind of visualization with some metadata backing it up so that you can say who started the discussion or how they directed the discussion or who's important for a discussion. So I don't like giving too many examples with him because it's way too easy, but a lot of stuff Donald Trump retweets. It's some crazy fringe conspiracy theory that a couple hundred people saw, and one of them was Donald Trump, and he retweets it, and suddenly tens of thousands of people were talking about it. So this kind of graph analysis can show you what really contributes to the spread of this information in a visual, easy to understand way, because you're going to be seeing like, oh, suddenly this person retweeted it, and that led to a lot more discussion. They were a lot more important for the spread of the information. Okay. Finally, from the tools, there's several tools developed by our partners from Sheffield. I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are a couple that are interesting. One is a rumor score that's kind of trying to figure out, based on the wording itself, whether a tweet is spreading unverified information. So this is not something that I would trust to give me information on a specific tweet, but something that it could kind of guide the searching through tweets. Because it's not trying to figure out what the tweet is claiming and figure out whether that's true. It's trying to figure out whether the wording of the tweet makes it seem like someone is making stuff up or spreading information without backup. Veracity is a similar score, again, it's a numerical score between 0 and 1, same as the rumor score. Again, it currently only runs on tweets, but it's looking on wording, not that the information is unverified so much as the person is trying to be intentionally misleading. So in an ideal world, this is going to be a good way to identify trolls, because you find people who try to annoy people or tell them stuff that's going to get them riled up and confused. The hyperpartisan detection, on the other hand, is defined on news articles, so it's a lot more reliable, although it also works on tweets at the moment. And it's looking for polarizing or judgmental language. So it's kind of an offshoot of sentiment analysis, but it's not trying to do general sentiment so much as trying to see someone who's expressing very strong political or religious views about some topic and identify them in that way. And then there's the stance detection algorithm, which grabs a whole discussion, usually on Twitter, so there need to be a lot of replies, like in the situation I was talking about before, and tries to put them, each tweet or retweet or comment, into one of the 4 stances, so one of the 4 bins, so support, deny, question, or comment. Those are kind of self-describing, but support is people who are agreeing with the initial claim. Deny is people who are disagreeing and they're starting an argument. Question are people who are questioning the initial claim. So they're not really saying it's wrong, but they're not convinced by the initial claim. And then you'll find that in reality, a lot of the cases, most things are comments. So people are saying something, they're not in any of the first three stances. These are the least interesting, but most numerous, so the category exists, so they can be placed in there. But it's interesting to see in the spread of different kinds of rumors, you can definitely see how the numbers of supporting denies vary over time, especially as something is identified as disinformation. You suddenly see like all the people supporting it suddenly vanish and a whole bunch of people denying or questioning it appear. Okay, and as I said, the final step of what we're targeting is the public outreach step, and this one is the least well defined. So far we know it's probably going to take some form of a chatbot as well as a publicly accessible workbench. The publicly accessible workbench is definitely going to be available, but we don't expect that millions of people are going to suddenly develop the habit of seeing a tweet and deciding, hey, I'm going to go to the WeVerify workbench and see if they have information on this kind of claim. That's why we're more aimed at some automatic ways to provide information and identify it and suggest it. Now the question here is how to make it accessible and responsive, how to make it convincing so that we can use all the data from the different evidence and reviews we have, but succinct enough that we don't overwhelm people with the amount of information we're providing. And mostly how we can be proactive in contacting people without turning into clippy and annoying them into never looking at this stuff ever again. And I would actually be really interested in hearing your opinions on the matter if you have any, because it's a bit of an open question for us. And in any time we have remaining, I'm happy to answer any questions or hear your ideas about how we can reach out to normal people. Like, what would you actually find convincing and convenient?
So yeah, probably most of you have connected to Slido, and actually we can see the answers of this question. So okay. So Andrey, would you use the system for automatic content verification of online content? By the way, all of you can connect to Slido using the hashtag DSS as answer to this question. But yeah.
See, I know for myself that I'm going to be using it only if it's convenient enough, because I can't be bothered to spend minutes looking at it.
It's a correct answer. No, there is no correct answer, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's not a big surprise, but I'm happy at least people are willing to work with it if it's convenient, and they're not going to wait for it to become super successful before even trying it out. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the plans for now, some of the tools are using different kinds of machine learning. And that's kind of where all of it goes. The image verification assistant for deep learning is using deep learning techniques, which are by definition machine learning, kind of. Sorry? I'm not sure. As I said, it's another company that's developing them, and they haven't really started and produced any alpha version yet. So I'm not sure what they might have not even chosen a framework yet. They might be experimenting with multiple ones. Let's see. There's automatic concept extraction. That's obviously a named entity recognition task, so that's NLP. There's image OCR that's also currently based on Tesseract with some additional improvements. And then all of the Sheffield algorithms I mentioned here at the end, these are all different kinds of ML algorithms.
Actually, we have more questions in Slido, but
Okay.
there's one more poll in there, so if you can go again. So
Okay.
where would this verification be most useful?
Where would this kind of verification be most useful for you? Do you want to see it on news articles, in Facebook, Twitter, or other social media like Reddit, 4chan, Gab, or other earlier sources.
And you can answer the question and see the results. So you prefer other social media. And
Okay, news articles. Interesting. Well, we're working with journalists, so at least it's the easiest for us to incorporate it there.
and there are 4 questions. Can you go through them?
Okay. Okay, so first one, can you identify if a piece of content will be popular before it is released? I'm not sure that we can. We're kind of looking towards it with the monitoring, but we're not trying to be as laser focused. So we're allowing to the journalists to kind of identify themselves what they want to monitor. So I would say we're not trying to do that exactly at the moment. Okay, do the rumor and veracity scores use dictionaries of words indicating intent, or have you implemented something else? It's something else. We have a corpus of different kinds of several thousand tweets that were actually used in specific spread in cases where like rumors were spread online in Twitter. So we let the algorithms figure out what the keywords are themselves. We can definitely benefit from a larger corpus for these algorithms, but we're not relying on predefined lists. Как стоят нещата с пицата? I have no idea. How you choose journalists who are checking news? Okay, so that's an interesting question. So in the consortium, we're actually working with journalists from Association France Presse and Deutsche Welle. So those are the people that those are the organizations that are participating at the moment. The plan for the duration of the project is to only incorporate people that the experts themselves trust. Obviously, once everything is up and running and we can kind of say we have a complete system, we're going to have to figure out a better way to incorporate experts. The way I envision it, at some point, it's going to become a large enough system that we can sort of semi-open it to any kind of expert, at least to a much broader number of experts. And then we can incorporate some kind of, I'm not sure what the right word is, kind of like a score for how reliable people find them, I guess. But that's kind of the distant future. For the duration of the project, it's mostly going to be AFP and Deutsche Welle and anyone they decide to include. It's certainly not us developers determining who gets to say what's true and what's not. Okay. I think, okay, so there's say something about the following. Schedule for delivery. Again, it's a 3-year project and there are like 2 years, 3 months left. So I imagine in about 2 years, we're going to have a mostly fully working system. There are going to be some early versions before that, but I imagine they're going to be pretty rough and not really as open to the public. Although if you're interested in keeping track of what's happening, I've left out some leaflets and stickers up front, so you can grab them and you can check out the website and follow us on Twitter for the developments. Stakeholders, I kind of answered that with the previous question, but we're working with journalists, so they're the ones that ultimately determine what's useful. So the stakeholders are the journalists from AFP and Deutsche Welle. Hardware to be used, we're just, for now, the partners are hosting the services themselves, so until we can get everything working. There's ultimately some plan for making the system self-sustaining, but I imagine that's for the very end of the project or afterwards. Team size is difficult for me to answer. There are I think 7 partner organizations working on this, and there are multiple people working in each organization. So there are quite a few people, but we're also quite specialized. So only 1 or 2 people are working on any given aspect of the project. Constraints and difficulties in tech stack. So the tech stack is quite different because, as I said, the different tools are developed by different partners, and we're not really trying to. We're kind of the coordinator because Ontotext is the one doing the integration layer, but we're not really trying to dictate what technologies they should use. We've just decided everyone defines an API and sticks to it, and beyond that, we let them do it whatever way they decide is good enough. Okay. Who do you plan to sell the system to? That's a good question, but not really my expertise. I know we've given up on the idea of selling it to journalists themselves because these organizations don't make a lot of money. But there are people in the project thinking about that. For one, I know there's a lot of interest in the social media services themselves to have this kind of information so they can actually combat the spread of disinformation. I know they have, the kind of money that it takes to support this project is change for them. So I think that's one of our plans. And the alternative is to just keep getting funded by the European Commission because they really want to prevent the spread of fake news online. How big is the corpus? About 7,000 tweets. Okay, so that's similar to the tech stack. Every kind of tool is written whatever it wants. Personally, the tools Ontotext are writing, which is the integration services and data layer, are all written in Java. I know the Sheffield machine learning stuff is mostly written in Python. Beyond that, I can't even tell you. Like a lot of the tools are just using libraries in a specific language. I wouldn't really call that using the language itself.
Okay, so I think this was the last question.
You have the time during the network to ask the rest of the questions, so yeah, do it in the network. Andrey probably will be here to answer, or you can approach him through his email or through the leaflet. So yeah, let's applaud him. And now I want to introduce you to the second